At a dinner meant to honor family, my mother gave my sister the house key and handed me a few loose bills like I was some struggling tenant. She said, "Pack your bags. You'll never afford rent." But what she didn't know, the house was already mine. What would you do if your family erased you right in front of your face? I pulled up to the house in a rental car that looked like it had done more miles than I had years. The gravel crunched under the tires the same way it always had, but the sound didn't feel familiar anymore. A valet approached, adjusted his vest, and smiled at me politely, clearly assuming I was one of the caterers. "Delivery?" he asked. "No," I replied. "Just family." He stepped aside with a nod, and I walked through the front door of the estate I used to call home, but never quite belonged to. It smelled the same, lemon oil and old wood, still draped in the same heavy curtains. The kind of house where people don't talk about emotions, only expectations. Inside, on the entry table, was a neatly folded napkin in the shape of what Mom always called the captain's sail. She used to tell guests it was a Southern tradition, but really, it was just her way of reminding everyone who steered the ship. I glanced toward the large window. Mara had arrived 10 minutes earlier in her spotless SUV. She was already outside, hugging people, waving at neighbors like she was running for office. Perfect posture, perfect hair, perfect narrative. If I vanished tomorrow, she'd probably just fold me into a speech about resilience and family branding. I walked slowly, not because I was nervous, but because every room in that house reminded me how carefully they'd all learned to live without me. We gathered in the formal dining room. The air was laced with champagne and compliments. Mom floated between conversations, introducing Mara to a few local business types she'd invited over. Folks who clearly didn't know this was supposed to be a family dinner. I guess to her, they were all just extensions of her social resume. "So, what are you doing these days?" one of them asked, glancing at me after finishing a story about their son's law school acceptance. Before I could answer, Mom cut in. "Oh, Julia. She's still doing that little tech thing, right? Start up something?" I smiled. Tight. "I work in product development. We help small businesses manage their financial systems." "That's nice," she said, like she was commenting on a child's crayon drawing. "I thought you'd be done with all that by now." I could feel Callum's glance from across the room. He didn't speak up, but I knew what he was thinking. Same as me. They always made it sound like I was chasing a hobby, not building a career. I didn't correct her. No point. Dinner was served shortly after. It wasn't long before Mara picked up the mic. Figuratively, of course. She always knew how to command attention without seeming like she was trying. Her voice was soft, persuasive. Every sentence had the subtle gravity of someone used to being listened to. "We all contribute in our own ways," she said, sipping her wine. "Some of us build, some of us drift, and that's okay." There was a chuckle, not loud, just enough to sting. I didn't look around to see who joined in. I leaned in slightly, met her gaze, and said, "I don't drift. I just choose directions you don't understand." She blinked, once, and then turned back to her plate, smile still fixed. I could feel the table shift, even if nobody said a word. Callum texted me under the table. "You okay?" I didn't answer. Midway through the second course, I excused myself, said I needed the restroom. Truth was, I needed air. The kind of air that didn't carry the weight of unsaid things. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, the one Mom insisted on keeping just before the dining room, saying it helped her check herself before walking into a room. I looked at myself now. 31, educated, independent, and still somehow small in this house. A memory came back. 15 years ago, Mom had told a neighbor, "Mara takes care of the family." "Julia's still finding her thing." That line had replayed in my head for years like a song I hated but couldn't turn off. I washed my hands, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the dining room. As I sat down, I noticed the napkin at my place, folded in the same Captain Sale shape Mom adored. Perfect edges, sharp creases, like everything in this house. I picked it up quietly, smoothed it flat, and folded it into a triangle. Plain and deliberate. I didn't look at anyone while I did it. Then, as the glasses were being refilled for dessert, I lifted mine, just slightly, and Mom leaned forward with that same sweet smile she always wore when she was about to say something that wasn't sweet at all. The air in the room barely moved as I lowered my glass, still trying to process the weight of Mom's smile. One of those saccharine things that always came just before she said something to bruise your spine in front of a crowd. Dinner carried on like it always did. Napkins crisp, silverware aligned like soldiers. The main course was being served when she did it. "You know, Julia," she said, pausing just enough to catch every ear, "if you can't pay your share this month, pack your bags. This isn't a charity." Forks hovered mid-air. Glasses were frozen halfway to lips. Even the piano music in the background suddenly felt louder, like it was trying to drown out the tension. I blinked once, slowly. I didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone, just stared at my plate like the food could save me. I wasn't shocked by what she said. I was stunned by how effortlessly she made me small in a room full of people, not just family, strangers, guests. I felt Callum's eyes on me from across the table. I didn't look. I knew if I did, I'd crack. The napkin in front of me, folded into that ridiculous Captain Sale, suddenly felt like a chain around my throat. A woman 2 seats down, Tilda Harrow, one of Mom's church committee friends, laughed in that nervous way women do when they don't want to pick sides. "Oh," she chirped, "I thought you'd moved out years ago. Or was I thinking of Mara?" It wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. It was casual, dismissive, like I'd never taken up space to begin with. Laughter followed. Not mean, just soft and stupid, enough to sting. I finally looked up. "You were thinking of Mara," I said flatly. "She always makes sure everyone knows where she is." Tilda blinked at me like I'd just insulted her salad. Mom didn't say a word. Mara just sipped her wine, like she was above it all. The flood came quietly then, not tears, but a memory. 2 winters ago, when the roof leaked during a storm. I was the one on the ladder, hammering a tarp in freezing wind, while Mom watched from the kitchen with warm cocoa in hand. Mara had been in Palm Beach, but when people asked, Mom said, "Mara handled it." And I had let her, because I thought grace mattered more than credit. Callum, without a word, reached for the napkin that had slid halfway off my plate and placed it back neatly in front of me. It was such a small thing, but it hit me harder than Mom's sentence. This wasn't a dinner. It was a production, and I was the character written to be pitied. I needed air. I slipped out through the side hallway, leaned against the stone railing on the veranda, and stared into the night. Through the dining room window, I saw them, laughing, passing stories like wine, pouring memories that no longer had me in them. "They keep me small," I whispered to myself. "So they feel big. They call it love, but it's ownership." A voice from the past came rushing in. Felix, my old mentor. "If someone controls your narrative in your silence, it's time to write your own." That's when I remembered the deed, quiet, sitting in my purse, tucked beside a travel-sized pack of tissues and an old lipstick. Signed, filed, final. The house they were sitting in didn't belong to Mom anymore. It belonged to me. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't walk back in to argue. I wasn't there for a fight. I wanted to watch, to see how deep the play would go before I pulled the curtain. When I returned, Mara was holding court again, telling some story about her new branding contract. "We're helping Heritage Farms pivot to digital, preserving legacy through tech. Mom beamed, lifting her glass. This family has always had strong women. Mara's doing what I always hoped for. There it was again. Not my name, not even a glance. I sat down, adjusted my fork, and smiled. Not out of sarcasm, just readiness. I told them I needed to check on a call. I didn't. I needed to breathe where no one could watch me do it. I slipped away from the clatter of dessert forks and casual cruelty, walking upstairs toward a guest room that used to be mine. Used to be, before Mom decided it needed to be refreshed for company. The door creaked like it remembered me. Inside, the room looked like a catalog. Pale gray walls, hotel-style bedding, a vanilla-scented candle I'd never buy. Nothing of me left, but on the far wall, above the desk, a collage still hung. A project Mara had once slapped together for some family-themed fundraiser. Photos of birthdays, barbecues, graduations. My face was in one of them, but the name beneath it wasn't mine. It read, Mara, 2008, Launching Ideas Young. My hand rested on the edge of the desk. Cold wood. I opened a folder sitting there, expecting brochures. Instead, I found Mara's startup pitch materials. The branding was slick. The language over-rehearsed. But the images, those were mine. One shot showed a community event I'd co-led in Atlanta 3 years ago. I remember the exact moment it was taken. I had just handed a young girl a laptop she'd earned through our coding program. That smile hadn't come from the camera. It came from her future. And Mara had claimed it. She wasn't even on the team. She had visited for 1 day. 1 damn day. I stood still, letting the cold of the floor seep through my shoes. They don't erase me out of neglect. They erase me to replace me. I sat on the bed, more out of necessity than intention. Reaching under it, half expecting a box of old shoes or forgotten socks, I pulled out a leather-bound notebook with my initials still faintly embossed on the cover. I opened it. A receipt fluttered out. It was a printed bank confirmation, $6,500, wired to Mom's account. The timestamp was from a winter night, exactly 2:14 a.m. She had called in tears. It's the roof, honey. The insurance won't cover it. I just don't know what to do. I hadn't hesitated. I transferred the money while still in my pajamas, never asked for it back, never even brought it up again. Back then, Callum had said, "You sure you don't want her to sign anything, just for clarity?" I told him, "She's my mother. That should be enough." A few weeks later, I sat through a dinner where she told a friend, "Thank God for Mara. She really stepped up when the house needed saving." I'd let it go. I thought silence was grace. Now I knew better. Grace in this house was a costume you wore while someone else took your beau. I folded the receipt, not with anger, but precision, slid it into my clutch like it was just another item on a checklist. I wasn't collecting proof. I was gathering mirrors so they could see themselves later, the way I saw them now. Downstairs, the laughter had picked up again. I returned slowly, letting the weight of everything I'd just seen press against my spine, but not bend it. No one noticed I'd left, not even Mara, who was now presenting her team's success story to a group of nodding guests. Our mission, she was saying, has always been about inclusion, about lifting others with what we've been given. Someone clapped. Mom beamed. And there on the slideshow, behind Mara's perfectly polished explanation, were more images from my work, reframed, reworded, rewritten. I sat back down at the edge of the table, didn't touch my drink, didn't adjust my seat. They were performing. I was watching. They wanted me silent. Fine. Let them sing their lies a little longer. The fall always echoes louder when the house is quiet. The living room had emptied slightly since the last course. People had moved to other clusters. The air, now thick with wine and well-rehearsed stories, felt harder to breathe. I walked past the open hallway and heard my name, Not lovingly, not in curiosity, just utility. She's just helping around here until she finds her footing, Mom said, her voice low and pleasant, like she was commenting on the weather. I mean, she's living with a friend, she added. I've asked around, nothing serious, thank God. I stopped short, my back to the wall. I didn't have to guess who she was talking to. Probably another woman who wore diamonds with jeans and spoke in condescension disguised as concern. Suddenly, Callum's words from weeks ago came back to me, soft, half joking. She asked if you were settled, asked if I paid the rent, or if you did. I'd laughed it off. It's just how she is. No, it was exactly who she was. Not curious, just harvesting. I stepped back into the dining room. I knew my face was blank. It had to be. Anything else, and she would call it overreaction. Vivica turned, radiant. Julia's always been sweet to help us keep the house in shape. The words were wrapped in sugar, but landed like stones. Help us. Not lives here, not takes care of the place. Help as in passing through, help as in not one of us. That night, I wasn't the homeowner. I was the house sitter. Mara stood by the projector screen, her laptop propped open on a side table. She queued up a slideshow like it was a TED Talk. Photos of our family flashed one after another, some from years ago, others recent. Mixed between them were shots clearly meant to tie into her business pitch. The front of the house, taken from the west angle, just after the landscaping had been redone. I took that photo. I remember waiting for the sun to hit the roof just right. Mara had used it as the cover for her brand site. Then came another photo, Callum and I kneeling with a group of elementary kids, handing out tablets. The caption read, Mara's Leadership Outreach. I didn't say anything. Vivica clasped her hands together. This is exactly why Mara carries our family's legacy. I didn't breathe. I just pressed my fingers under the table, into the cloth napkin, until my nails met wood. That was all I needed to keep from speaking. They weren't erasing me. They were using me as decor. I excused myself a moment later. Said I needed to make a call. No one objected. The hallway was dimly lit, silent. I walked through the guest wing. The room that used to be mine had been turned into a neutral space with beige everything. No pictures, no personality. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. There was a printed list on the nightstand. House duties, while Julia visits. It read like a checklist for a live-in helper. Check pantry inventory, coordinate floral arrangements, update Vivica on mail. My chest didn't tighten. My voice didn't catch. This wasn't grief. It was clarity. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as staff, unpaid, unnamed, managed. I took out my phone, snapped a photo of the list, just in case I ever needed to remember exactly how far people would go to reframe loyalty as labor. Back at the table, dessert had been served, plates clinked softly. Mara's napkin was folded into the captain's sail. Of course it was. Perfect angles, sharp creases. Mine was still a triangle. Vivica noticed. Without hesitation, she reached over and replaced it, carefully crafted, quietly imposed. Some things should remain consistent in tradition, she said with that same smile that always meant control. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I picked up the napkin, unfolded it slowly, then refolded it into a triangle again. But this time, I didn't set it in front of me. I placed it in front of her. Tradition isn't memory. It's manipulation when it serves only a few. They dimmed the lights in the living room right after dessert, like they were setting the stage. One of the cousins plugged in a flash drive. Suddenly, the television lit up with a slideshow. Mom stood near the center of the room, wine glass lifted, chin high, smile locked in place like it had been rehearsed. Let's toast, she said, to the women who hold this family together. The first image was of Mara, naturally, smiling in a blazer, standing in front of the old church, then one of Mom and Grandma in black and white, then Mara again, this time in a graduation robe. The images shifted: garden parties, charity events, Thanksgiving dinners, faces I recognized, events I'd attended, except I wasn't in a single one, not cropped, not blurred, just gone. A neighbor sitting behind me clapped her hands. "Mara, this place reflects you. You were always the responsible one." I nodded because anything else would have been a scene, but inside, it cracked me. They didn't forget me. They made sure I was never seen to begin with. I waited until the last toast ended, until the glasses were down and the room had turned to murmurs again. Then I moved, slowly, toward the hallway where the real photo wall was. Wood frames, glass-covered, hung in pride of place. It had once been filled with birthdays and messy Christmases, trips to the lake, one summer when we'd built a treehouse and everyone pretended not to be afraid of falling out. Now it was different. Curated, clean, no dust, no history. I stopped in front of one frame. It used to be my 7th grade photo. Awkward bangs, too big shirt, a smile that still believed being quiet was the same as being kind. Now, same pose, but Mara, same backdrop, same bench, different name. Behind me, I heard whispers. "Didn't Julia renovate the porch?" No, Mara did that. Remember her post with the before and after? Of course, the post had gone viral. I'd taken the damn before photo. I stared at the frame, thought about that holiday years ago when the roof had started leaking during a storm. While everyone was at the outlet mall, I stayed behind, climbed a ladder in the cold, and fixed the patch myself. Mara got thanked for calling the handyman. A week later, this wasn't memory loss. This was rewriting, in real time. I walked back into the room, grabbed a folded copy of a group photo I'd printed months ago, one where I had still been part of the circle. It was in my clutch, tucked between a tube of lipstick and the receipt I no longer needed to pretend I'd forgotten. I crossed the room and handed it to Mom, didn't say a word. She looked at it, took a sip of her wine, and said, "Well, some photos just fit the decor better." I nodded. "I suppose so. But some truths are harder to crop." She didn't respond, didn't need to. The silence around us did the work. Later, I sat by the fireplace. The laughter had settled. People had shifted to polite conversation and second servings. I just watched the flames. A little girl, I think she was the neighbor's granddaughter, walked over, holding a cookie. "Why aren't you in the pictures?" she asked. I smiled, leaned forward, and said, "Because I stopped waiting for them to frame me." She nodded, like that made perfect sense, then walked away, crumbs trailing behind her. I pulled out my phone, opened the deed app, stared at my name, clear, in bold, on the title to the house. I wasn't leaving the house. I was about to reclaim it, and they were still pretending I didn't belong. The dessert plates hadn't been cleared yet when Mom turned to me, her voice just loud enough to skate across the table. She held her wine like a prop, practiced, polished. "You've never really lived on your own, have you?" she said casually. "Callum pays the bills?" The room didn't gasp. They weren't shocked, just curious enough to pause, forks hanging mid-air. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I set my glass down slow. "I pay more than my share," I said. "You just never asked." She laughed, soft, dismissive, the way people do when they're about to turn an insult into a joke. Vivica turned to Mara and Dexter, my brother, like we were in court and she needed character witnesses. "You've seen how things are. I just worry about her." Dexter looked at the centerpiece. Mara smiled, tight, unbothered, playing the neutral one while her silence did the damage. I realized then, this wasn't conversation. It was theater. I wasn't being spoken to. I was being used as a scene. I stood, quietly, walked toward the drinks table, refilled my water like nothing was happening. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear. It's always been fascinating how you express concern only when people are watching. Someone chuckled, nervous. Someone else coughed. Vivica didn't miss a beat. Julia, don't be dramatic. It's a dinner, not a deposition. I turned back to the table, still calm. You made it one the moment you brought witnesses. That landed. I saw it in the shift of bodies. In the way Aunt Valerie suddenly remembered she had to check on her husband. In the way Callum looked at me, not with pity, but pride. I sat again, faced her directly. If you want truth, ask me. If you want applause, keep telling your version. She didn't answer, just sipped her wine and looked past me. She wasn't expecting a rebuttal. She'd forgotten I had a voice. The buzz of someone's phone broke the moment. Callum checked his screen, looked at me, then turned it so only I could see. Mara's Instagram story. A photo of the family estate, same shot I'd taken 2 years ago. Overlaid with a quote, "Strong daughters support their mothers. Weak ones blame them." I stared at it, then smiled, not out of amusement, but clarity. I stood again. This time, I walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the decorative family crest book they always left out for guests to admire. I opened it flat on the table, placed my phone beside it, screen bright, pulled up to my bank receipt, $6,500. Transferred to Vivica Bellamy, labeled roof repair, urgent. Vivica started to speak. For someone who's blamed, I said, I seem to hold a lot of the weight. The room stopped. No clinking, no murmurs, just quiet. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I simply told the truth. I stepped away again. This time, down the same hallway I'd grown up walking every morning before school. At the end of it stood the mirror. The one Mom had installed with the line, "So you can make sure you look presentable before facing the world." I looked at myself, not to check how I looked, to acknowledge that for the first time, I saw someone who didn't need their table. I had built one, quietly, outside their walls. I walked back into the dining room, where the candlelight flickered like a scene already ending. I sat, picked up my napkin, folded it into a neat triangle, set it beside Mom's plate. I wasn't going to ask them to look at me anymore. Not when I finally started seeing myself clearly. After everything, after the silence and the cutlery conversations and the careful lies, Mom stood up again. I knew that stance, straight back, chin up, voice rehearsed. She held a velvet box in one hand like it was something sacred, something she'd earned the right to bestow. "I want to take a moment," she said, "to honor legacy." I stayed quiet. You learn to wait when you know they're about to leave you out. She opened the box, revealing an old brass key tied with a satin ribbon. Deep blue, the family's color. The key to the house. Symbolic, of course. The locks had been changed long ago. "Tonight," she said, turning slightly toward the head of the table, "I formally pass the stewardship of this home to Mara, who embodies everything this family stands for." The room erupted, clapping, toasts raised. Mara played modest, smiling like it was unexpected, like it hadn't been scripted. I didn't move, didn't blink. I heard a whisper behind me. "But I thought—" Then silence. They didn't even finish the sentence. That was the point. The erasure had gone ceremonial. They weren't just forgetting me. They were celebrating that I was no longer needed. Vivica sat down again, content. The show went on. Laughter resumed like nothing had just shifted in the tectonic plates of my family. A few minutes passed, maybe less, before she reached into her purse, pulled out a small white envelope. She placed it beside my plate, close enough for everyone to see. "Just to help you get back on your feet, honey," she said. "Rent in Asheville isn't cheap." The envelope was unsealed. A few bills peeked out just enough to humiliate, not support. No one touched their glass. No one looked at me directly. But everyone saw it. I didn't reach for it. I placed my fork down. Not dropped. Not thrown. Just aligned it with the edge of my plate. There's no power move more insulting than charity disguised as concern. Callum coughed, a quiet acknowledgement across the table. I didn't respond. Not with words. I didn't need to. I glanced across the table. Mara's napkin was folded into Mom's signature captain's sail. A symbol of approval, of direction. Mine, still the triangle I'd folded earlier. I picked it up again. Slowly, folded it into a swan this time. Not fancy, not symbolic. Just mine. I set it in front of me like a new flag. Mom noticed, didn't speak. I did. You always said tradition is what keeps a family from falling apart, I said, not looking at her. But maybe it's what's kept us from growing up. Someone stood, said something about needing to feed their cat. Another followed. The exit had begun. I stood, not to storm out, not to beg, but to walk to the sideboard where the heirlooms lived. The silver tray from my grandparents. The framed picture of Dad holding baby Mara in his lap, like some proof of chosen favorites. I picked up the photo, turned it over, set it face down. The sound was small, but in that room, it echoed. You didn't give me a seat at this table, I said, but I bought the table. Mom's face tightened. She opened her mouth. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a single sheet. Cream paper. Embossed letterhead. Deed of ownership. 127 Willow Lane. Owner, Julia Bellamy. The laughter hadn't died down yet when I stood. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough to feel my spine straighten. Everyone looked my way. I didn't raise a glass to toast. I didn't smile. I let the air settle first, let the discomfort crawl in. Then I spoke. Before dessert is served, I said, my voice even, I'd like to offer something else to the table, a different kind of truth. Callum leaned forward in his seat, jaw set. Mara tilted her head, eyes narrow. Mom stiffened, but didn't speak. I pulled in a slow breath and turned slightly toward the guests. You all toasted to a house tonight. You applauded a symbol. But the key that was handed over earlier, that wasn't a transfer of ownership. It was pageantry. Sentiment. I looked toward the ribboned box Mara still clutched, like it meant something. That key unlocks nothing. A fork slipped off a plate across the room. Someone muttered, "What's going on?" I reached into my clutch, pulled out a single folded document, took my time unfolding it, and walked toward the center of the table. I laid it flat between Mara and Mom and said clearly, "This house was purchased by me, paid in full, 17 months ago." The silence was thunderous. A cousin whispered, "Wait, what?" I kept going. No need to rush now. Truth didn't need speed, just clarity. I looked directly at Mom. "You knew. You helped broker the deal through Uncle Nate. You asked me to keep it quiet so it wouldn't confuse the family narrative." Her face didn't change, but her hand trembled slightly on the stem of her wineglass. She opened her mouth. "That was for the good of—" I stopped her. "No! That was for the good of your image. It wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder." Mara stood halfway, voice shaking under polished control. "This house is part of our family legacy. You can't just—" I cut her off, still calm. "You posed in the legacy. I paid to keep it standing." I reached again into my bag and slid out another document, a renovation invoice. My name in bold, dated long before her first branding campaign. Roof repairs, water damage restoration, property tax, backdated and cleared. Callum, who had been quiet, leaned slightly toward the guest beside him and said in a voice low but deliberate, "She's been living here the whole time, handling bills, keeping the place from falling apart." Someone, one of Mom's committee friends, whispered, "Then why the toast?" I answered before anyone else could, because it's easier to crown someone in public than to admit who carried the burden in private. I didn't expect anyone to argue. No one did. I walked back to my seat, folded my napkin back into the same triangle I'd placed beside Mom's plate earlier. Then I left the deed where it was, in the middle of the table, like a spotlight they couldn't turn off. No request for apologies. No dramatic speeches, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. Vivica reached for her wine again, slower this time. Mara hadn't sat back down. She stood there, unsure if she'd just been exposed or simply no longer needed. I closed my eyes for a second, not from exhaustion, but from release. When I opened them again, the air in the room felt thinner, like something had been lifted. They knew now, and knowing was something they couldn't take back. They didn't clear the table right away. Plates sat untouched. A few people mumbled half-excuses about early mornings, long drives, pets waiting at home. One by one, they slipped out. Some nodded to me. Some didn't meet my eyes. No one said the word sorry. The room held a strange quiet, like a party after the music dies, and no one knows who's supposed to turn off the lights. I watched Mara still standing near the head of the table, her eyes glued to the deed. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't touched her wine. Vivica stayed seated, same glass in hand, half full, unmoving. She didn't look at me, didn't look at Mara, just at the tablecloth. I walked to the window, watched the gravel shift under tires as each car backed out of the driveway. No horns, no goodbyes, just the slow retreat of people who had spent too long pretending nothing was wrong. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just watches the room clear out on its own. My father stood. For the first time all night, he moved without being prompted. He walked to the side of the table and picked up the napkin swan I had folded earlier. He didn't look at anyone, didn't even sit down. He just straightened the napkin gently with both hands. Then, voice steady, said, "She owned this house the whole time. She just didn't want to make a show of it." That was it. No speech, no sides taken, just a sentence that landed somewhere between truth and too late. Some saw it as support, a small redemption. Others saw it as cowardice, the final proof that he had always watched from the sidelines. I didn't react. I didn't need to. Silence by then had become my strongest language, and I had learned how to let it do the talking for me. I walked the halls slowly, not because I needed to think, but because I finally had space to. I touched the edges of old photo frames as I passed them. Not to change what was there, not to correct it, just to remember who they chose to include, and who they left out. The kitchen was mostly empty. Callum was washing glasses at the sink. His sleeves were rolled up. He didn't look surprised when I walked in. "You did that without raising your voice," he said quietly. "I hope they heard it anyway." I smiled, just enough. "It wasn't for them to hear," I said. "It was for me to stop whispering to myself." He nodded, went back to the dishes. I stepped out the back door, into air that finally felt like mine. The night had cooled. The lights inside flickered softly through the curtains. I stood there for a minute, no rush, no tension, then turned back and walked inside. The dining room was nearly empty now, just the chairs, the heavy table, the deed still resting in the center like a quiet monument. I walked to my old seat, picked up my napkin, folded it, not into a triangle this time, but into the captain's sail. Then I placed it where my plate had been all evening. Beneath it, I slid a note. "For whoever sits here next, may you earn your place with truth, not performance." I didn't look back as I walked out. Didn't wait for one more speech, one more denial, one more deflection. I didn't reclaim the house to live in it. I reclaimed it so I could finally leave it, on my terms. Have you ever had to take back something they told you you never deserved, just to walk away with peace?